Thanks for joining us today and welcome to the 9th webinar in the Keeping It Real series. So I'm Anna Richards, Commercial Lead at Vitaccess, and I'll be moderating today. I'm joined by Catherine Bottomley and Dawn Lobban. So Dawn heads up the Envision the Patient team within the Envision Pharma Group. She's got a strong background in medical affairs and an interest in optimal patient involvement in medicine development. She's also actively involved in key working groups, such as the International Society for Medical Publication Professionals and Patients-Focused Medicine Development. She's always exploring effective ways to ensure effective patient engagement, which we'll find out more about today. And Envision Pharma Group are actually partnered with Vitaccess, and they're a global leader in medical affairs and healthcare communication. And on the other side, we have Catherine. And so she leads the design of patient-reported data acquisition strategies at Vitaccess, specializing in real-world primary data collection from patients, caregivers, and clinicians with our special digital focus. She's an expert in understanding, measuring, and articulating patient experience of disease and treatment in the real world. So Vitaccess, on our side, we're an innovative research organization, and we combine scientific expertise and technology to provide real-world patient-centric solutions. So today, over the next 40 minutes, we're going to take you through patient engagement in the publication of real-world evidence, and we're going to explore the role of patients in the design, delivery, and communication of real-world studies. So in particular, we're going to focus on the value of the patient voice in publications of real-world evidence. And that will be followed by a Q&A session. So you can put forward your questions in the Q&A box on the side panel and add them at any point during the webinar. So we'll come to those at the end. And so I'm going to pass you over to these two experts to tell you more.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Anna. If we just go to the next slide, please. And the next. Okay, so welcome everyone. And as Anna's mentioned, we're here today to focus on patient engagement in the publication of real-world evidence. But in order to do that, we need to consider the broader role of patients in data generation and analysis. And many of you may well be familiar with this roadmap, which is adapted from a published version by Jan Geisler and his colleagues back in 2017. And it really eloquently identifies key areas where patients could and should be involved in partnering with pharma companies throughout the life cycle of the drug development. As we can see, this roadmap advocates patient involvement in the initial stages of identifying the priorities, right through protocol design, conducting the research, and importantly, communicating the results. So Catherine's now going to explain in more detail of how this works specifically in relation to real-world studies.
Thank you very much, Dawn. So before we focus on patient involvement in publications, I'm going to spend a bit of time just setting the scene, talking about patient involvement in the design and the execution of real-world studies. So the roadmap that Dawn has already shared shows activities within a clinical trial process where patients can and perhaps should be involved. Many of these activities are also applicable to real-world studies. So you can see here that we've highlighted some of those key areas where patient involvement can also be applied to studies that are outside that clinical trial setting. And again, these activities are very similar to those within the clinical trial process and setting up a clinical study, from identifying research priorities through the conduct and the publication of research. But in fact, in real world studies, there may be more flexibility for the involvement of patients in the research process. There's certainly more flexibility in implementing their suggestions, their changes, when you're working outside the framework of a clinical trial. So just to give an example of this, a common example that we see in our work is around the selection of patient-reported outcome measures to include in studies. So in clinical trial settings, this might be governed by a number of factors, including the availability of measures that are validated in that population of interest, and those which contain concepts that are relevant and important to that particular patient group. If feedback from patients during protocol development shows that there are perhaps additional outcomes that might be important to capture in that study, things that are important to that group of patients, for example, impact on work productivity, there's often limited scope to include these in a clinical trial setting, but in a real world study, there's often more flexibility to expand upon this type of data and more broadly the types of data collected and also the format used to collect it. So just moving on to the next slide. So why should we involve patients in real world studies? Well, research has shown that most patients are actually unaware of real world evidence, what it is, and its actual or its potential uses. But involving patients right at the beginning of the study planning process has the potential to significantly improve study design and delivery. So as well as the opportunity to gain a better understanding of patient needs, it's also a chance for protocols to be considered in real life scenarios. So people imagining what it would be like to take part in that study from a patient perspective, identify any potential issues, and then resolve those problems before a study opens for recruitment. Involving patients can also have the potential to improve recruitment and retention rates in real world studies, and I'll come on to provide you with an example of that in a study that we have conducted recently. There's also the opportunity to validate your key findings and the interpretation of your data with those who are living with a particular condition. So beyond just a group of researchers sat in a room, actually talking to those people living with that particular condition and finding out what that data means to them. There's also, particularly if you partner with patient associations, the higher chance of your study results and those key messages reaching patient stakeholders. So on the next slide, I'm going to talk about some of the practical approaches to involving patients in real world studies. Before we talk about some of those practical applications, the first thing that you need to consider is your own approach as a project team to collaborating with patients. It's important to view your collaboration with patients as a meaningful partnership, not just a box ticking exercise. It shouldn't be something that you have to do. It should be something that you want to do and that has additional benefits to you and to your research. It's obviously important to view patients as experts. Patients are people who can provide unique insights, unique ideas that might not always be aligned with those of the research team. And so it's really important to be prepared to be flexible. It's also important to spend time developing relationships with your key patient stakeholders from right at the start of a study and maintaining that relationship as the study progresses. We would also recommend making a plan or an agenda for the patient activities throughout the study with details of what those activities involve and the types of time commitments that you may ask for from a patient or from a group of patients. And on that note, it's important to think about the groups of patients that you're going to involve. Should this be the same group of patients for all activities, or should it be different groups? So using this example of a digital real world study, we can show you some of the areas where we would typically involve patients in our studies. The three activities there outlined in the pink text are the areas where people would typically think to involve patients in studies, and they tend to be around the early phases of the research cycle. So around helping to prioritize research questions, developing research designs, planning a recruitment strategy. But as the study progresses, there are different areas where it can also be beneficial to work with patients. When we're particularly thinking about a digital study, it's important to get patient feedback on the UI, UX, the user interface, user experience aspect. It's important particularly to get feedback on the use of a data collection platform. So what's it actually like for that person taking part in that digital study to be inputting their data? Is it user friendly? Is it easy for them to input high quality data regularly? There's an obvious role for patients when you're thinking about translation and localization of study materials, getting feedback on those translations, making sure that any adaptations that you make are culturally appropriate in a study, for example. Then moving on to participant recruitment. So particularly working with patient associations, those patient associations can be extremely helpful in terms of promoting that study to potential participants, to sending out, for example, emails or social media posts, posting on their websites, etc. And when they have been on that full study journey with you and collaborated with you from the start, in our experience, they are much more likely to be positive about working with you in that capacity on a study. There's also the opportunity to involve patients in feedback on analyses, which we've already touched upon, and then of course publications, which we will go into in more detail. So to bring that to life a bit more, before I hand over to Dawn, on the next slide you can see a case study. So this is a case study of an ongoing study that we have here at Vitaccess. It's an adaptive patient-reported digital registry in Charcot-Marie-Tooth disease, and any information that you see here on the slides is publicly available. In terms of the design of this study, it's an international observational study. You can see the geographies there. At the moment, the study has been rolled out in the US and the EU5. It's a bring your own device study, so the patient can enter their data on any device in any location. And as with the majority of our studies, it's a protocol-driven, ethically approved study. Over the last 5 years, we have enrolled over 2,800 adults into this study. And in terms of the governance, which we'll come on to talk a bit more about, this study was co-created with patient associations and also key opinion leaders from each of those scope countries. In terms of the data capture, again, this is a fairly typical type of study design for us. The data set includes detailed demographic information as reported by patients, disease characteristics, treatment history, and then a broad range of patient-reported outcome instruments to quantify burden of disease. So on the next slide, just thinking about patient involvement in that study, what kind of activities did we work with patients on? Well, we, at the start of the study, formed a study advisory board with patient representatives, KOLs, members of our research team, and also members of our sponsors' research team. And that study advisory board meet regularly through the duration of the project. And through those regular meetings, development of relationships, we have built what we feel is a truly collaborative relationship with those patient associations. One of the patient associations recently invited us to present at one of their research days to publicise the study and their involvement in it. And part of that relationship building was down to all of the activities that we conducted around the study design phase. So at the start of the study, we set up a pre-launch workshop. We did that face-to-face. Obviously, that's not been as easy to do over the last few years, but certainly the advantages of meeting up face-to-face have been quite clear for us to see in this study in particular. Our group of patients then inputted into the protocol and the study design. They talked to us about what living with CMT was like, and we took that information and fed it into our patient-reported outcome strategy. It helped us to select the patient-reported outcome measures that would be included in this study. They then reviewed the patient-facing platform content for us, provided feedback, and then they were very actively involved in participant recruitment through social media posts and promoting the study at patient conferences. Throughout the duration of the study, over the last 5 years, there have been various study amendments, and so we've also consulted our group of patients on each of those amendments. They've reviewed the original patient-facing material, and they continue to review new patient-facing material as the study progresses. They have also been involved in the reviewing of all of the interim analyses. So at the moment, we are conducting annual analyses on the study. So they review both the analysis plans and also the key messaging and the results, the data that comes out of those analyses. And then finally, we have been co-authoring with this group of patients on our study publications. On the next slide, thank you, I will talk about one of the additional positive impacts of working with this patient association in this study. And this relates to improvements in recruitment rates and retention in the study. So one of the patient associations that we worked with was the Charcot-Marie-Tooth Association. They shared a post about the study on their social media page on January the 11th in 2020, and that post linked to a video about the study. We'll share a link to that in the chat. You may be interested to look at that. It's a video where a patient talks about their experience of taking part in the study, inputting their data to the registry and what that piece of research meant for them. Up until that video had been shared by the Charcot-Marie-Tooth Association, it had been viewed 21 times, and you can see that the day after it was shared, those views had gone up to 249. 6 weeks later, we had over 440 views, and that then resulted in 28 additional study participants over a single weekend period. So obvious advantages there to improving study recruitment and engagement. So before I hand over to Dawn to focus on the involvement of patients in publications, on the next slide, I wanted to share my key takeaways. My key takeaways for involving patients in real-world studies. Well, first of all, that any patient or public involvement should be viewed as a meaningful two-way partnership. I think the whole research team's attitude towards involving patients is really key in shaping the success of it throughout a project. It's also important to consider patient involvement across every study step, as we've discussed. It may not always be possible to include patients at every step, in which case we suggest prioritizing the areas that will have a direct influence on people taking part in the study. We think it's key to develop relationships with key stakeholders early in that process. We also suggest drawing up a more formal patient and public involvement plan and a timeline per project. This may sound obvious, it's not always easy. Listen to the priorities and the needs of the patient stakeholders throughout that process. And finally, always have the end, whether the end is dissemination or publication, in mind throughout that study process. On that note, I will hand over to Dawn.
That's great. Thanks, Catherine. So if you just move to the next slide. So Catherine's nicely demonstrated ways in which patients can, and indeed are, adding real value in the generation of real-world evidence. And when we think about that contribution and we look at the authorship criteria that are shown on this slide, and these are defined by the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, such patients are clearly fulfilling the first authorship criteria. They are substantially contributing to the conception or the design, the acquisition or analysis, or indeed the interpretation of the data. And in some of the examples, to multiple ways to fulfill authorship criteria 1. And so then when we look at the additional criteria, we can start to see how patients can then go on, given the opportunity, to fulfill all authorship criteria. So relating to allowing them to have a critical review of the manuscript during the drafting process, and then final approval and having accountability. In reality, this rarely happens, although we are starting to see an increase in patient co-authorship throughout the medical literature. So just thinking about why this is important, and if you just move to the next slide, please. So what is the value of patient authors? So in our experience and the opinion reported by others, patient authors can really help to maintain a focus on what is relevant and applicable to the overall objective of the study and the resulting publication. So they can often help to bring the publication back to what's really relevant. They obviously represent the patient as a key stakeholder in the communication, and they can ensure that the needs of their community, both in terms of content and also focus, are included, but also language and format are key considerations that they can input into. And patient partners also have different distribution networks to co-authors that you may also be working with. So they can really help to broaden reach of key data, and they may also increase the level of trust in the resulting publication. Next slide, please. But what is in it for them? Why would patient partners want to be involved in real-world evidence publications? So as patient partners become more experienced in the drug development, we're seeing that there is a real increase in awareness of the value that they can bring. They really do understand that their insights are unique and they can help to increase overall understanding of what it means to live with a specific condition or what the unmet needs of their patient community really are. By getting involved early and helping to design studies in ways such as those described by Catherine, they can see the value they bring to improving things for their community. And ultimately, as with many authors, they are really passionate about optimizing care. But there are barriers for patient partners, and these can affect patient partners in different ways. While many of us on this call may have been educated in a relatively academic environment where publishing is common, this isn't the case for many patient partners. And often just the language we use and the processes that we follow can actually be quite a barrier, can be quite excluding for patients. In addition, many patients have to juggle their interest in being involved with managing their disease and managing any related treatments or side effects of their disorders. They may also have careers, and oftentimes, unlike healthcare professionals, their careers may not benefit from being involved in scientific publications, and therefore they may struggle to allocate time to get involved in such activities. Access to resources and technology that can seem very obvious to us can often be a barrier for patient authors. So, for example, just dialing into this Zoom call could be relatively stressful if it's not something you do on a daily basis. As I mentioned earlier, the patient voice in publications is still not common, and this really does mean that there is a lack of role models for aspiring patient authors. And this can often lead to a lack of belief that this is something that they could and should be involved in. And then the final barrier is really a desire for privacy, and not all patients want to be defined as such in the public domain. Next slide, please. So a few years back, in our team at Envision the Patient, we were really keen to better understand some of these barriers and really try to help address them to help patients to become more involved in authorship. So first, we wanted to understand the evidence, and so we did a systematic literature review to look at patient involvement in publications. The systematic literature review and the analysis was co-developed and actually co-authored with patient partners. It was first presented at the ISMAP meeting back in 2019, and elements of it can also be found in the PFMD Book of Good Practice. And it's since been published in open access in Research, Involvement and Engagement. So based on the literature analysed, the authors of this paper also identified a number of risks, but importantly, more benefits for involving patients as co-authors. And some of them are shown here on the slide, and some of them I also mentioned on the previous slide. So based on this evidence, the authorship team, which included the patient co-authors, went on to make some recommendations in this paper on how best to support patient authors at all stages of the publication. So before you start, how best to help them become engaged in the process, how best to support them during the development of the publication, and also following submission and addressing peer review comments and subsequent discussions of the paper. Next slide, please. So it's not just our team, and other teams are very active in this area and are very keen to develop guidance to support patient authorship. So we can learn a lot from academia, where patients are very involved in research and often in publications. And in particular, Dawn Richards' group in Canada have done some great work in this space. So they published this very helpful paper. It was actually co-developed by a group of researchers who worked with patient partners at the Chronic Pain Network. And the aim of the paper was to provide guidance to facilitate conversations between researchers and patient partners regarding not only the research, but importantly, the resulting publication. So while the overall principles of academic authorship and acknowledgement obviously can't change, there are nuances for how we can interpret these principles through the lens of patient engagement to really help to facilitate this collaboration. Such guidance, and some of this is noted on the slide here, includes things like aligning early on shared goals, making sure everyone is aware upfront of the goals of the publication, clearly defining roles and responsibilities up front, and really making sure that patient co-authors understand what it means to co-author a publication. Often allowing more time for the publication if that's needed, and I touched on this earlier when talking through some of the barriers. And then also being clear around some practical issues such as compensation if that is involved. So on the next slide, I just wanted to touch on the fact that while there's lots of guidance available to facilitate patient co-authors for the co-authors, we also recognized a need for some specific training for patient advocates who themselves want to get more involved in publications, and whether that's authoring their own research or co-authoring pharma-funded research. And it's really to help them to overcome some of the technical barriers that I mentioned earlier, especially around language and process. This need was also recognised by our colleagues at WeCan. So WeCan are a European cancer network, and they run a very successful educational academy for patient advocates. But what they recognised was, while their academy was very comprehensive and really supported patients to become advocates throughout the life cycle development, there was a specific need for some training in the area of publications. So we joined forces with WeCan, and we were able to co-create this unique open access publications training course. It's specifically designed for patient advocates. It was multi-pharma funded, but the scope and the content was driven by an independent patient editorial board. The training itself was developed by our publication experts, and it's structured around 4 key modules, and it covers all aspects of publication, from planning through to submission and addressing peer review comments. So the course is freely available on the WeCan site, the link shown on the slide, and I think Anna is kindly putting it in the chat. Okay, next slide, please. So I've touched on some of the helpful guidance and the training that now exists, and we were really keen to try to help to pull all of this together, because obviously there are other resources out there that are also helpful when considering patient co-authorship. So we wanted to create a single repository called Patientauthorshipcom. This was launched earlier this year, and the site really aims to pull resources together that can support both patients and pharma companies or publication professionals who are embarking on patient co-authored publications. It's been valued by a range of different users. And if you just do the build, we can see that it's actually structured around some of the key questions that we repeatedly come across when thinking about working with patient co-authors. So some of the topics we've already touched on today, such as authorship criteria, authorship disclosure, and reimbursement. But as you can see, there's a lot of different questions here, and it's really a helpful site that I would encourage you to visit if you are embarking on a patient co-authored publication. It's free to access, and the resources are freely available to download. And please do provide any feedback. The plan is to keep this site regularly updated as additional resources become available. Next slide. So lots of good work starting to happen around resources and guidance, but is it working? Are we seeing real world data published, and are patients co-authoring these publications? And I think the answer is yes, increasingly so. I think historically there has been a real lack of the patient voice in medical publications. We've seen a lot more involvement of patients early on in the life cycle development, so involved in trial design, for example, but actually that continuation of that patient engagement through to publication and co-authorship has often been lacking, but we are starting to see this develop. And data collected outside of a clinical trial setting in the real world can really help to answer a range of important questions around understanding the lived experience, understanding patient unmet needs, understanding the patient journey. And there are many ways to collect these data. So, Catherine's talked already about prospective real-world studies, typically involving a quantitative element, but we're also starting to see more qualitative survey data published. We're starting to see social media analysis published, and even outputs from smaller groups, focus groups and advisory boards, especially in the areas of rare diseases. Such studies can often involve patient partners at some stage in their generation, and therefore are increasingly being co-authored by patients. And I just wanted to share on the next slide a case study of a project that I've been involved in for the last couple of years. It was started back in 2020 and it was published at the end of last year. So the objective of this study was to understand the lived experience of a rare neuromuscular disorder. It was actually myasthenia gravis. And the study was funded and co-authored by UCB Pharma. So as a first step in trying to understand the lived experience, we initiated a patient council involving 9 leading patient advocates from across the globe. Insights were then collected from a range of sources, including a survey of 54 patients with myasthenia, and the insights were collated and analysed in collaboration with the patient council. So the thematic analysis spanned across 9 life domains and resulted in 42 consensus statements that the patient advocates felt accurately described the lived experience of myasthenia gravis. And from these, 5 themes emerged from the data that the patient council felt really strongly needed to be communicated around living with this condition. 2 of the patient councils then went on to communicate these consensus statements and themes in a patient co-authored publication. So if you just move to the next slide. The data were initially presented at a leading neurology conference, the American Association of Neurology, by one of the patient co-authors, and the full manuscript was then subsequently published in Neurology and Therapy. And the high altmetric score that we can see for this paper and the fact that it has been accessed nearly 4,000 times really supports the value of such patient-led and patient co-authored publications, especially in rare diseases where these patients often are the experts. Okay, if you just bring up the build. What was actually really nice about this study was that the 2 patient co-authors actually went on to produce a short video. And the video was published alongside the paper, and it summarizes in lay language the findings of the study. And this can really help to broaden the reach of these data to other lay audiences, including potentially patients. You just go to the next slide, please. Okay, so the case study, I think, is a really nice example of how you can work with your patient co-authors to think about publication enhancements and maybe other alternative formats that we are seeing more and more in the literature. So firstly, on the left of this slide, thinking about plain language summaries in particular, these have become much more common recently due to a lot of work that has been demonstrating their value and the best practices and how best to go about working with patients to co-create these important summaries. They are developed according to health literacy best practices, and they are really designed to make data accessible to a range of non-specialist audiences. If we want to do something that is a more detailed communication, we can now publish standalone peer-reviewed plain language summaries. So this is an actual standalone article. It has its own DOI, and it actually describes a previously published manuscript, but in lay terms. So Future Science Group are the publisher that are really leading the drive on these plain language summary articles. And again, these can really help to bring your data to life to a much broader, perhaps a non-specialist audience. And then finally, on the right of the slide, just thinking about other more innovative formats that are also starting to appear as publishers really get on board to help to integrate the patient voice into medical publications and also think about patients as a potential audience. So on the right of the slide, this is an example of a peer-reviewed podcast, which our team supported with. It was actually a podcast that was authored and presented by a patient co-author and a healthcare professional co-author. And it was discussing some of the key data that came out of a recent oncology conference. It was actually ESMO earlier this year. And what was interesting about this publication was that not only did the patient and the healthcare professional keep the language very simple to prevent any language barriers, but they really focused on the data that came out that is of particular relevance to patients. So the content and the language of this podcast were produced with a patient focus. And then on the next slide, I just finally wanted to touch on patient author affiliation. So as I've just discussed, there's growing interest in really supporting patients to co-author publications. There's guidance, there's training, a range of new publication formats to capture the patient voice, but is it helping? And moving forward, we are keen to see if all of this work actually results in an increase in patient authorship. And also the hope is that by ensuring that patient co-authors are visible, they'll act as role models to encourage others who perhaps think that this is not for them, to give them the confidence to get more involved. But in order to track this trend, we really need to be able to easily identify patient authors in the literature. And this currently isn't the case. So in this publication by Oliver et al., we advocate the consistent use of a meta tag to capture patient author as an affiliation in PubMed. So you can see in the bar chart that just by using patient author as an affiliation search term, we can start to see a year-on-year increase in patient authorship, although obviously the numbers here still remain low. You can see that this year, despite being only halfway through the year, we're already at similar numbers as to last year. And obviously, there's still ongoing debate about the best meta tag to use. And I know lots of different meta tags have been discussed. But I do think there is value in helping us to be able to identify and track patient authors and hopefully inspire other patient authors to consider authorship. Okay, so on the last slide, in summary, Catherine and I hope that we have inspired you to consider patient co-authors, where a patient has been involved in ways that Catherine described, such as the design, the data generation or interpretation of your real-world studies. We hope we've encouraged you to be flexible in your approach and consider how you can work with your patient co-authors to overcome some of the barriers that they are potentially coming across to really make sure that that collaboration works for everybody. Hopefully we've directed you to some helpful resources to facilitate the patient co-authorship of your publications, and I hope that you will have a chance to go and check out some of those resources after the webinar. And we hope we've described some of the publication extenders and the formats that you can explore to reach broader audiences, including patients. And ultimately convinced you that by working with patient co-authors, you can actually improve the quality not only of your real-world studies, but also of the resulting publications. So now I'll hand back to Anna for the Q&A. Thanks, Anna.
Thank you, Dawn. Thank you, Catherine. So we're now in the Q&A section and I see a few questions popping up. So I'm going to put the first question forward. Might be more Catherine's bag, I think. I'm just going to say this one. In involving the patient at design stage, do you think there is a risk that this can create bias of participant preoccupations oriented focus? So could it create a loss of overview by considering that the patient represent the absolute entirety of the patient base?
Ooh, very good question. I think I'm going to take that as two separate questions when I answer it. So first of all, do I think there's a risk that you can create a bias of participant preoccupation focused? Yes, there is a bias. However, that can be reduced by the way that you consider that patient as part of the study team. So we would always consider a patient who is involved in our research as we would any member of our own research team, or by extension, our sponsors' research team. So it would be no different for us to having somebody within that study team who perhaps spoke up a bit more than somebody else, or whose views were stronger. Having said that, there are some situations in various aspects of study design where we may want to have more of a patient focus, and we may want to implement some of their suggestions over perhaps suggestions made by a research team. So an example there might be understanding what it's like to live with a particular condition. The selection of patient-reported outcome measures is the example that I've used so far. It's really applicable again here. We would want to listen to that patient's views with perhaps more of a greater focus than we would the rest of the research team there. On the other hand, there might be conflicting views on sort of aspects of study design, where some of the suggestions made by patients might not be sort of practical or feasible. And in that case, you might want to then prioritise the feedback or the views of those with that study design expertise. So yes, there absolutely is a risk of bias, but in the way that you approach a patient as part of that team, you would minimise that. Second part, and I'll try and keep this concise, creating a loss of overview potentially by considering that the participant represents the absolute entirety of the patient base. Yes, again, really important question, and we would consider that on an individual activity basis. So there may be some activities that you would want a patient to be involved in where you would want to make sure that the data or the information that you got from that activity was absolutely representative of that patient base. And so in that case, you may involve larger groups of patients, but there are some other activities where, for example, reviewing a data collection platform and providing feedback on their experience of entering data, where instead of looking for a complete representation, we are looking to identify commonly occurring issues. And if there's a very obvious commonly occurring issue, we would usually identify that within a much smaller number of discussions with a much smaller number of patients. So yes, you absolutely, there absolutely can be a flaw in considering that that participant represents the entirety of the patient base, but in some other ways that can be an advantage. So I guess there are different ways of approaching each of those activities with that in mind.
Thank you, Catherine. I've got just a general question, which I'm just going to answer quickly about the webinar recording. So I can follow up with whoever would like a copy following the webinar. So if you just send me an email, it should have been on the comms. I've asked in for questions earlier. Just pop me a message and I'll send that over as well. And as well as any resources that anyone would like, I can share that as well. So I've got another question here. So one is, for patients who wish to co-author a pharma-sponsored paper, but they might not have time to complete a full training course, what do you recommend as the most helpful resource to get started?
Okay, yes, I can take that one. Thanks, Anna. I think there are some very simple and helpful resources that exist that can really just help patients to understand what it means. I think so, for example, if you go to the Patientauthorshipcom site, there is a version of GPP3 in plain language. So obviously the good publication practice guidelines is something that authors typically are very familiar with, but patients may not be aware of. And it's important that patients understand their role as an author. So just having a very simple visual lay language version of GPP can really help patients to understand what they're signing up for. And similarly, there is a one-page visual of the process of developing a publication, because again, while we're very familiar with drafting and reviewing and peer review, this process isn't necessarily something that patients are familiar with. And really, as with any of us, when we embark on something new, just understanding what the overall process looks like can be really helpful. And then the other thing I would just add is having that call up front to talk them through what the expectations are, and some of these materials that I've just mentioned can be incredibly helpful just to give them the confidence and to highlight to them the value, the unique value that they will bring to this publication can really help as well.
Yes, thank you, Dawn. I'm going to do another question here quickly. How do we get bias created by digital health inequalities? Often an issue in those with chronic disease. So who wants to take that one?
Do you want me to take that one, Anna? I'm happy to comment on that. I think there are a number of different biases that we can discuss here, we would always consider these in our study designs. They can range from things like age bias and age barriers, which we always try to contest. I think if you'd asked us that same question sort of 10 years ago, we'd be saying something quite different. And then there are, of course, the barriers in terms of access to digital applications. And this is all around the study design. So, for example, if we were aware that a portion of the population were unable to access digital applications, we may provide a paper-based alternative for data collection. In terms of age bias, we would make sure that we were representing those particular patient groups, those particular age groups within our patient feedback. So this is absolutely a sort of study design question, which we would certainly consider.
Fabulous. I'm going to try and sneak in one question. We're a bit running over, but I'm going to quickly put one more in because there's a lot of questions. And I was going to just add, actually, if you've not put your name attached to it and we haven't answered it just today, please feel free to email me and we'll get those answered directly with you. So I'm just going to sneak in a quick one. How do you identify and then reach out to the patients that you want to partner with? Not talking about authorship. And do you have criteria for the patient selection?
Yeah, absolutely. So this again depends. I'm happy to sort of take this on, Dawn, if you're happy for me to. It really depends on the studies. There are a number of different ways that we reach out to patients to partner with. It's usually a combination of our sponsors having relationships that they have built with patient associations already that we are then able to sort of utilize. We may have relationships built with patients ourselves. We may look, for example, for patient co-authors, and we may do some desk research ourselves. And it's usually a combination of those approaches. There are, of course, expert patients out there, which is another discussion as to whether or not you include somebody who self-identifies as an expert patient in your research group. But it may be worth also contacting expert patients to be able to direct you towards groups of patients who would be happy to take part in research. Do we have criteria for selection? We do if we are looking to get a representative sample. So I guess this relates to my answer to the previous question. We may attempt to stratify depending on the activities that we're going to ask those patients to partner with us on.
Fabulous. Okay, thank you. I think we're going to stop there. I'm aware there are some more questions, but we're going to finish now because we are running over a little bit. So our next webinar will be talking about using prospectively generated real-world data to support access for medical devices. And there's the link to register. It's on Wednesday, the 24th of August at 2 o'clock UK time. I just want to say a huge thank you to Catherine and Dawn today. You've been absolutely amazing. We wouldn't expect anything less. So thank you so much, and I look forward to seeing everyone next time. Goodbye.
Thanks,
Thank
Anna.
you.
Bye.
Bye.